Welcome to this edition of the Machine Sessions, and today I am talking to somebody who I have been wanting to talk to for years. Actually, we've been meaning to talk for years, and we've never done it. So this is a first. I'm talking to Iain McGilchrist. Iain is Iain is many things. He's a psychiatrist. He's a neuroscience researcher. He's a philosopher. He's a literary scholar. He's a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. And for the purposes of this podcast and for this discussion around the themes of my book Against the Machine, he is the author of two very significant books, which I think will probably come to be seen, and probably already are being seen as some of the most significant analyses of the state that we're in today, in terms of our culture and the ways it's gone wrong and perhaps the ways it could go right. So Iain is the author of, firstly, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which is a really wonderful book. And secondly, I don't know if I could call this your masterwork, Iain, The Matter with Things, which is an enormous 2-volume achievement. The notes of which, the footnotes of which are almost as big as my entire book, are clearly the product of a lifetime's work. And both of these books are in different ways coming at the same question, which is the state of our minds, and whether there is something in the modern Western brain, literally, that has skewed our way of looking at the world. Would that be a good way of putting it, Iain?
Yes, I think that's a very fair way of putting it.
So maybe before we start digging into the depths of it, for the sake of people who don't know about your journey and your work, maybe you could tell us how you got here, how you got from your studies, from your psychiatry practice into this vast project of trying to work out what's wrong with us, if you like.
Yes, well, I've always felt since my teens that there was something wrong with the way that we look at the world now. I came from a non-religious family, but in my teens, I just learned a great deal about Christianity and so forth, and I just felt that the world was not the inanimate, unresponsive object out there that the science lessons taught me that it was. And I thought that parts are not the same as the whole. You can put as many parts together as you like, but they won't reconstitute the whole, which has different qualities. And so I've always had interest in, I suppose, philosophical questions. I read English literature at Oxford. I then got a fellowship at All Souls, which allowed me to do whatever I liked for 7 years. And during that time, I wanted to explore the mind-body problem, why it is that when we study literature, we destroy it. Because I wrote a book called Against Criticism in my 20s. And I, in a way, left that world because I loved it too much to want to be operating on my friends all the time. There's a nice story of Ted Hughes that he had a dream when he was reading English at Cambridge that a fox came into his room and put a bloody paw on his essay and said, "Why are you destroying us?" And I think that was more or less the feeling I had. And it boiled down, to cut a long story short, as far as I could see philosophically, to not understanding the relationships between mind and body. When we took something that was an embodied, intrinsically implicit and unique being, a poem, a work of art, or whatever it was, and analyzed it, we turned it into something generic, explicit, abstract, and it lost all its meaning in the way that once you explain a joke, it's no longer funny. And so that made me want to do medicine. So I at the grand old age of 28, I went back to medical school and became a first-year medical student, which anyone who's been there will know what I mean when you say you are the lowest form of life on the planet.
I'm married to a former psychiatrist myself, so I've experienced it all secondhand.
Oh, you really experienced it all? I went to the Maudsley in London, the Maudsley, Betterman Maudsley Hospital, and I got interested in the topic of brain hemisphere differences, partly through some questions that arose when I was learning my neurology, which were not asked by the people who were teaching it. They were glossed over and simply ignored. For example, why is the brain structured as two almost entirely separate masses? Since its power comes from making connections, why would it be like that? Secondly, why is the brain actually asymmetrical? And it's asymmetrical anatomically and functionally, both grossly and at a microscopic level. Now, what is that about? Because if you just wanted more space, more computing space, you would just do it evenly. And the third thing that surprised me was that the band of fibers, and this was the only thing that was actually mentioned as a bit of a shock, was that the band of fibers at the base of the brain that connects these two hemispheres, called the corpus callosum, is very largely involved in inhibition. I mean, it passes messages, of course, but the ultimate function is often to say, you keep out of it, I'm dealing with it. Now, that was highly suggestive to me that there were two kinds of things going on in our brain, both of which were required at the same time, but couldn't be done in the same locus of awareness. And so the story from then is that I started to research it. I have done for 30 years. I did some neuroimaging research on the brains of people with schizophrenia in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I've carried on work and clinical work and research since. And I was advised very much not to go there because there was a lot of fairly crude stuff, most of it entirely wrong, said about the hemisphere differences. For example, the left hemisphere was said to be rational, but at least dependable and linguistic. The right hemisphere wasn't interested in language, painted pictures, and was somehow a bit airy-fairy. Well, it turns out that pretty much every part of that is wrong. Both hemispheres are indeed involved in reason, in language, in emotions, and in visuospatial understanding. So at that point, people just despaired and shrugged their shoulders and said, well, we must have got it all wrong. But I wasn't satisfied by that because clearly nature had intended two things here, the three questions that I mentioned a minute or two ago. And so I carried on researching and found that we'd just been asking the wrong question. We'd asked the question that you'd ask of a machine, which is, what does it do? The left hemisphere does this, the right hemisphere does that. But instead we should have asked the question we'd ask of a person, because after all, these hemispheres, the brain, are very strongly part of who we are, and change when we change, and we change when it changes. So the question is how? And the two hemispheres just attend to the world quite differently. What is that difference? It's the difference between a particularizing, detailed attention on a minute element out there that we know what it is already and we want to get it. So it's in the service of grabbing stuff. And so important is that all the animals that we've looked at have this strange arrangement that their brains, however primitive, are divided, asymmetrical, and that one of the hemispheres is interested in grabbing and getting. And this has generally been the left, and it certainly is in human beings. So the left hemisphere pays attention to a tiny part of the environment, something that it wants to pick up and eat, something it wants to pick up to build a nest, something it wants to manipulate. So it's there to manipulate and exploit the world. But if that's the only kind of attention it can pay, it won't last, because while it's getting its lunch, it'll become somebody else's. So there has to be another part, another center, another locus of consciousness that is capable of seeing quite differently, attending to the world differently. I didn't realize to begin with how important this question of attention was, but it dawned on me pretty fast that this was fundamental, because how we attend to the world changes what we see there. And so in the left hemisphere, the world seems to be made up of bits, circumscribed little tiny bits that's highly resolved in detail, not moving, not connected to anything else, decontextualized, abstracted, disembodied, and utterly explicit. So it is what it is, and it is what it says on the label. Whereas in the right hemisphere, it sees the whole complexity of the lived world. That nothing is ever finally certain, ever finally fixed, but always in motion, that everything is ultimately interconnected, that its meaning comes from the context, the other things that it's connected to, that it is a fully embodied world, not just an abstract one made up of concepts, and that its world is alive. And very importantly, it has meaning from the things that lose their meaning when they're made explicit. And these are just about everything that matters to us. Among them is love, sex, poetry, music, architecture, art, religion, ritual, narrative, myth, faith. All these things that give meaning to our lives become diminished when we stand back and pay a kind of super detached attention to them, the kind that the left hemisphere pays when it's standing back and thinking, I'm going to kill that, I'm going to kill that, I need it just to hold still while I get it. So that's effectively it. And so there are these two versions of the world that we each of us have in our brains. Well, I say that's in our brains, but they're produced by our brains. And they have different qualities. And those qualities are not easily reconcilable at any one moment. They both need to be borne in mind, and what happens is that our brains alternate between these visions very, very rapidly and below the level of consciousness, so we're not aware of it. If we became aware of it, it would freeze us to the spot. We'd become incapable of effective action. So nature has hidden that fact from us, but when we stop and talk about the world, in other words, we philosophize, and particularly when we have to do this in a detached, disembodied way, for example, over the internet, where we're not with people in their presence, we don't know them and live with them, then a lot depends on being consistent and adopting one or other of these ways of thinking. So what seems to happen in societies is that when they're small and when they're at their outset, for example, Greece in the 6th century BC, Rome around the year dot, and I think I would say Italy, France, and Europe in general from the 14th, 15th century, the Renaissance. It works very, very well, and everything flourishes. Science flourishes, great discoveries are made in maths, but there's also wonderful music, wonderful art, drama, astronomy, whatever takes a step forward. And by the way, it's a mistake to think that the right hemisphere is the arts and the left hemisphere is science, but we can come on to that. I mean, just forget that idea. They're both involved in both. But what seems to happen is that these two things work together in a fruitful relationship in which the right hemisphere oversees the whole and the left hemisphere does a lot of the donkey work. But as things progress, the left hemisphere seems to be emboldened by the idea of control. And civilizations get bigger, they have to control bigger land masses, they have greater wealth, and it becomes effectively a bureaucratic machine that grows up. And like a machine, it hasn't the subtlety that humans have about context and place and time and all the things that rules and procedures leave out because they're non-explicit. All that gets lost, and the civilization coarsens, becomes crude, power obsessed, and loses its insight into art and religion and the big questions. So that's laying out the reason why I think it's important at the outset.
And your argument, really, in both of these books, I mean, it's quite explicit in the title of your first book, The Master and His Emissary, and the subtitle, which is, I think, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. The argument, tell me if I'm wrong here, the argument you're making is that this image of a master and his emissary is the way that you're seeing these two hemispheres of the brain. So this right hemisphere, the one that can see the whole, is designed to be the master, and the left hemisphere, the one that's very good at picking apart the bits, that is supposed to be the emissary of the master. And the way the kind of cultural case that you're making, which you just touched on there, is that in the modern West today, certainly in the modern world, maybe more generally, the emissary has usurped the master. So effectively, we're in a position now where we have become very, very good at seeing the parts, and we've completely lost sight of the whole. And that's the kind of the cultural tragedy that we're kind of living in at the moment.
Absolutely that, and not just that, but we don't see the depths. The left hemisphere literally doesn't see depth, so it sees two-dimensional representations of what to the right hemisphere is a three-dimensional living entity with depth. It doesn't see depth in space, it doesn't see depth in time, and it doesn't see depth in emotion. And I think that the shallows, to quote Nick Carr's title, is where we're at. We've lost our ability to see deeply into things and understand them, and to understand them together. Yeah.
So what's your feeling about why this has happened? You just seem to suggest that it's effectively a manifestation of scale. When society gets to a certain point, does it need to employ the left hemisphere so much that it loses touch? Is it an inevitable thing, or is it something that's quite specifically happened in modern culture?
It's a good question. I suspect that it's a bit of both, but that when a society becomes very large, I mean, we now supposedly live in a global village which has none of the qualities of a real village at all. It's not really a place. It has no social richness. And if you look at China, I mean, China, at the end of the Master and His Emissary, I point out that Eastern ways of thinking, particularly those of China, Japan, Korea, and India, are much more balanced in their use of the right and left hemispheres. And, it's an interesting question that, why is it that China, although very far advanced in science, more advanced than we were at the time, never really turned into the science-dominated society that ours has become? But if you think of the periods when Chinese civilization has been unwieldy and very large, it has lost that sense of the unique and the individual, and tended to the terracotta soldiers is, although rather an amazing thing, it's an example of a society that is thinking of people like, entities that can be substituted one for another. And that is effectively another part of how life becomes when you think in this left hemisphere way. It only understands generalities, it doesn't understand the unique case. And I mean that literally, so that people who have a couple of cases, a farmer who had a Swiss farmer who had a right temporoparietal stroke. Before he had his stroke, he knew all his cows by name just by looking at them. But after he'd had the stroke, he could only barely tell a horse from a cow. And another, as it happened, Swiss woman who had spent her life studying the birds of her native country, after a right temporoparietal stroke, said all the birds look the same. If we feel that we're treated as interchangeable numbers that have no real individual differences, and try to answer these ridiculous things where you have to fill in yes or no on a questionnaire or online, you can't move on until you've made an answer. There's never a box for what I want to say, which is something more subtle. Well, it depends on the circumstances and who I'm with and all the rest. So all that stuff, all that subtlety gets lost, partly through exaggerated scale, partly through a lust for power, because and of course they go together, but it's clear that the value that the left hemisphere holds is that of power and control. Whereas the right hemisphere is able to see other values. It's actually a better guide to truth, much better. It's also much better at understanding beauty. And it's more aware of what goodness is, not the ticking of boxes, but actually a disposition of the heart. And so all of this means that the right hemisphere dominated world tends to be lacking in values and in a sense of purpose other than its own invented purpose to grab as much as it can.
One of the biggest manifestation of this in terms of the way that we see the world at the moment, which is one of your targets, I suppose, in all your books, is what we could call scientific materialism, which, as you say,
Yes,
could maybe be distinguished from the scientific process because, as you've said, other
very
cultures
much.
managed to use the scientific process without reducing the world to this very clumsy materialistic notion that, material matter is all there is. So I suppose that it's almost a chicken and egg question for me. Which comes first? Is it the scientific materialism, or is it the divided brain?
Well, that would only be a good question, if you like, if one was going to cause the other. And I must make clear that I'm not saying that the brain causes anything. I'm just saying that it's interesting that a certain range of things that we wouldn't normally group together tend to shift together in a culture. And the brain adapts to the culture it's in, and the culture adapts to the way the brain is responding. So there is a constant two-way relationship between the brain and culture.
So whatever the
Neither one
sorry, go on.
having primacy over or being causative of the other.
Whatever the exact reason, we've somehow managed to back ourselves into a culture that is hugely left hemisphere dominated, and therefore
Yes.
has created a technological and a political infrastructure that is almost entirely designed to take the world apart. And then, as you say, basically exhibit power over it, because the way that the scientific mindset in the West seems to proceed now, certainly the scientific materialist mindset, is effectively it's a manifestation of questing for knowledge so that we can use the knowledge for power, so that we can use the power to further dominate the ecosystem and further effectively chop up the world. And the end point of this technologically at the moment is in the kind of fever dreams of Silicon Valley, where we end up talking about conquering death and uploading our minds into the cloud and terraforming Mars and the rest of it. Which is a kind of, it's sounds very often to me like a form of mental illness disguised as a kind of political aim. And one of the things that struck me most in your book actually was quite explicit comparisons between some of these ways of seeing an actual mental illness. I remember feeling the same when I read work by Antonio Damasio years ago, in which he talks, a neuroscientist, in which he talks about his own patients and their mental illness and how this manifests actually at a societal level. At one point you make the point in your book that this was very striking to me, that so much of art from the modernist period onwards looks like the kind of thing that's done by people who have right hemisphere damage to their brains.
Absolutely.
So would it be entirely over the top to suggest that we're living in a society which is actually in some way mentally ill?
Well, it's a phrase that is neat and apt in the sense that I do think we're not fulfilling our purpose. We're not thriving. We are, in fact, in the process of destroying ourselves. And people who attack themselves and commit suicide are usually considered to have a mental disturbance. And I think that is definitely the way we're at the end of the Master and His Emissary, and also at various points in The Matter with Things, my later book. I do say, what would the world look like if the right hemisphere was not functioning? It would look just like the one basically that we're in, on a whole set of about 20, 30 points. So there's no doubt in my mind that it's not that the right hemisphere is not functioning. I mean, our right hemisphere is still there and it's capable of functioning. But the analogy I like to make is between somebody who's bought a radio set and is rather having fun trying different things, and eventually finds a couple of channels that they want to listen to. But after a while, they just decide to listen to one. And it's like that. The other channel is still broadcasting. It's just that you're not picking it up. So we can recover the value given by the right hemisphere, which is almost everything. When the right hemisphere is not functioning, you would expect society to become mechanistic, bureaucratically overloaded, to be skeletally thin in terms of its understanding of emotion and spiritual qualities, and to exhibit all kinds of bizarre phenomena in relation to art, which there's so much to say about that I'm thinking of possibly writing a whole book about that. And if people are listening, I just want to say two things. I'm not against science. I'm a scientist, and I've greatest of respect for science. I just don't think that scientism, the belief that science can answer all our questions and that science can tell us that there is only matter, which it conceives as having nothing to do with consciousness, that position is not tenable. And the other thing is, I don't say that everything in the last 100 years of art and music is awful. Some of the best things I know come from that period. But all I'd say about that is you can't keep a really good artist down, even if you set up a cultural media which is phenomenally unconducive to great art.
Mm. I feel like in my life I probably felt in the early stages like you did, that you can look around yourself and you can feel very strongly that there's something wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. And in a different way, I've been trying to get at what that is. I mean, mainly through writing and when I was younger, through activism. But it's always seemed to me that the fundamental problem, which I keep digging away at, is obviously the things that the left hemisphere can, as you put it at one point, apprehend, whereas the right hemisphere can comprehend. Those things are easily measurable, or they tend to be easily measurable. They're easily defined, and they can get results which then create a kind of feedback loop where you think, well, that's worked, I'll keep doing it. Whereas the things that the right hemisphere can comprehend, the bigger picture, as you mentioned earlier, the art and the science, the art and the everything from human love to literature, is not actually easily defined at all, and it certainly isn't easily bullet pointed. Yeah. And so much of that seems, it's almost, as I say, I've tried to sort of grasp at this all my life, and it seems that's almost one of the fundamental problems. The things that the right hemisphere can do as you would have it are simply not easily defined. They're not easily measured. Therefore, they're not easily put into tick boxes or coding. And therefore, it's easy enough to say, as scientific materialists do, well, they don't really exist. You know, they're airy-fairy things. It's romanticism. It doesn't really matter. It might be fun in a novel, but we haven't got time for that. We're doing the real stuff. And so you can wave your hand at all of the actual, almost the heart of human reality, and say, well, never mind that.
Yes.
And that's and as I say, then you get this feedback loop of what the left hemisphere can do is very productive. And we can see what the productive nature of it is in terms of its grasping and its turning nature into culture and its profiteering and the rest of it. And many people benefit from those things. And so it's almost as if, as you say, we're just stuck in this loop of the things that can be measured. And yet at the same time, and you can feel this more and more in the culture at the moment as it becomes more materialist, people know there's something wrong. And they say more loudly that there's something wrong all the time. So... That's just a thought. It doesn't really go anywhere.
No, particularly the young, I think, which is extremely hopeful.
Yeah, that's very clear now.
A lot of young, I mean, one of the things I enjoy when I'm speaking in public is, that afterwards a lot of young people usually come up to me and are very interested and want to know what can be done and so on. And I'm very encouraged too by the evidence, such as it is, that people are returning to religion. I mean, they're returning to spiritualizing in ways that might not be not be free from their problems, but they are. At any rate, they're turning their backs on a world that is this ridiculously limited version of reality that is being sold to them by the old-fashioned, rigid materialists. So I think there's good evidence that we are seeing the shortcomings of it. But the difficulty is that you're always fighting against the fact that the left hemisphere can't see what it is it can't see. It doesn't know what it is it doesn't know. And in a quite literal way, the right hemisphere is much better able to understand the need for the left hemisphere. And in the myth of the Master and His Emissary, the Master appoints an emissary to go on his behalf and do the bureaucratic work, so that he is able to keep a proper oversight of things and allow the community of which he is the spiritual master to flourish. But the master knows that he can't do everything, but the emissary thinks, I do everything and I know everything. And the less you know, the more you think you know. It's a principle. Yeah, it's very common, and it's a principle called the Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology, but it's basically something we can all observe. that the stupider you are, the more you think you know it all, and vice versa. So, and so you get this thing that, the truly wise are those who say that they don't know. Que
Yes.
sais-je, said Montaigne, and, so on, and St. Paul and all the rest. Yeah.
And
The
what
Buddha.
I think when I was writing my book Against the Machine, which started off as a series of essays, I found myself concluding, somewhat to my surprise, that much of the crisis we're in now is a spiritual crisis, effectively, as I would put it. Everything from the kind of the divisive madness of the culture war to this kind of scientific materialism, to the sense of nihilism amongst young people, and indeed to this kind of, I think, very significant turning away from materialism, which you can see in lots of areas now, are all at root the basis, are all at root the result of a society which has turned away from everything that we would call spiritual. Because I can't think of a society in human history that I've ever come across that has not had a spiritual basis to it. Whether obviously
Right.
the religious claims are different, that's the sense of the metaphysics is different, but the spiritual basis of everything is very clear. And that's one of the fundamental things that scientific materialism throws out of the window. This notion that spirituality is anything of any significance at all. And it's almost as if I feel that the throwing of that out of the window has brought the whole house down around us. And it's this generation growing up now that's really having to live amongst the kind of collapsing rubble of it.
Yes. And I sometimes say, death is not the opposite of life. The opposite of life is the machine.
Hmm.
And I think that's a very important thing for us to bear in mind. And I must say, I came to your work through what I consider to be a brilliant and powerful essay, which I think was entitled The Cross and the Machine.
Hmm.
Am I right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, and I sent that to a lot of my friends. I thought it was, I mean, I have to say, you do write enormously well.
No, thank
And
you. That's nice to
well,
hear.
no, I do. I mean, it's a delight to read. And but in any case, the point that you are making, which I just so strongly applaud, is how things change when machines deracinate us and take us away from, I think, what you call the four P's.
Hmm.
If I can remember them, I think they're the past, people, place, and prayer.
Yeah,
And
that's right. Yeah.
and in a lot of ways, these are exactly the sort of things that the left hemisphere doesn't get. The left hemisphere is very much like a map, and a map is just a slice. It has no time or anything in it. It has no life in it. It's just a diagram that will help you get around in the real world. I believe that we're now living in the map. We've now mistaken the map for the real world. But all those things that those four P's refer to the deep context in which a human life is situated. So it is situated in a history, in a culture that tells a story. And it is, we are, whether we like it or not, even those of us who most strongly oppose it, are still children of it. And
Hmm.
understanding that is very important. Then the idea of a people is absolutely fundamental to human thriving. We are not atomistic. We're not just rootless individuals wandering around pursuing our own good, whatever that is. And how would we know what it was unless we were related to other people in a society? But we deeply need that. And the right hemisphere is far better at understanding other people, understanding what is not said as much as what is said, understanding above all metaphor, understanding poetry, understanding religious language, the implied, and understanding body language, facial language, and a general disposition that can't be broken down into pieces. Then when you come to the place is also where we are rooted. I mean, we grow out of the place where we are born, and we can move, and nowadays people move a great deal more in general than they ever have done. But that place is something to which we should have an allegiance, because it, in essence, forms us. And historically, we would stay there and give back. And and help that to grow. But we don't know who we are if we take away our past, our place, and our people. And finally, prayer. If prayer is thought to be a nonsense that has no meaning, and all I can say is if you're sitting outside it trying to work out what its meaning is, you're like somebody who's sitting on the bank of a river with a textbook trying to understand how to swim before getting in the water. There are certain things you will only understand once you experience them. But you know, I would see that your thesis as absolutely in harmony with my own understanding of the hemispheres.
Yeah, well, I find your work so valuable because it puts huge intellectual and philosophical and scientific flesh on the bones of my instincts, really. That's,
Yeah, well,
and I think that's true of a lot of people. We all have these instincts. We don't have your sort of erudition and your ability to actually go and dig into what's causing this. And I find what I also find slightly ironic about your work is that you're sort of using the tools of the emissary to undermine the emissary here, right? I mean, you're using
uh,
science, you're using philosophy, you're using the facts and the figures, you're getting them out there, you're kind of beating them at their own game. That seems to be what you're up to. You're playing them
well,
on
you
their
know,
own turf.
yes. Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable insight into what I'm doing. And people often say in a rather simple-minded way, "Well, your book is very left hemisphere because it's got lots of science and facts." I like to say, look, that doesn't make it left hemispheric. More important, indeed, in science is to have a highly functioning right hemisphere. The left hemisphere will repeat donkey work and will carry out a series of instructions that are linear. But that's not how breakthroughs in science are made. They're made actually by sudden aha moments, which are robustly associated with the right temporal lobe and amygdala. So I do that. But I also think that there's a point in which you have to talk to people where they are, not where you are.
Completely.
And I mean, if I talk from where I am, my words are wasted on the air because it won't be comprehensible. So what I want to do, and what I find from the responses I'm getting in the matter of things, is to approach the really, really big question: what can we take to be true? And to take people by the hand through the neuroscience and explain how that illuminates various things, which, you know, there they are, they're palpable, they're interesting. Then into epistemology, so what are the paths we can follow towards the truth? And I take those to be science and reason, but also intuition and imagination. And I talk about them. And then to apply that to the world. So if we were looking at it using all of those things and the insights that the right hemisphere gives us, what would the world look like? And the answer is it would look very different from the world that has been sold to us as a package and that is indoctrinated into children in the West, as though this is really a philosophically grounded, rich, but in fact it's baseless and thin vision of the world. And we really need to address that problem amongst many others.
Now, ironically, that's usually referred to as the real world, isn't it? The real world
Yes.
you have to get back to and stop your dreaming and get back to the real world. It's a very kind of common.
Well, of course, to the left hemisphere, that is the only world it understands. So
Yeah.
that to it is the real world. And it actually reminds me, you were talking about things that can be measured and how really all the important things can't be measured and can't be reproduced in the lab. So the idea that you're only going to take something as real if it can be reproduced in the lab and can be measured. But there's a beautiful book by a man called Geoffrey Muller called The Tyranny of Metrics. And it's a very beautiful and readable book. And what he's basically saying is that the observation, I think, is not original, but the amount of examples and argumentation he brings is truly wonderful. The observation that we measure what can be measured, but that what can be measured doesn't matter, and what really matters can't be measured.
And it's such a
So
simple observation in a way, and it's almost as if the culture has just taken one little simple wrong turn. It's almost how it feels. You've had to do this enormous amount of research to show that we've just made this small turn, and the small mistake is simply to say, look, not everything can be measured. There are lots of things that matter that can't be measured. Many things can be, and that's important. But actually, the minute you get into a mindset in which I like to call it the Richard Dawkins mindset, in which if
Yes.
you are effectively arguing that, if it's not real, if you can't, as you say, if you can't reproduce it in a lab, it's nonsense. That's basically the
No.
fundamental claim, and it's that in itself is such a kind of broken worldview, but that's the mistake. And it's in a way quite a simple mistake. It's simply to mistake what the left hemisphere can apprehend for the whole of reality rather than just a part of it.
It's a simple mistake, but it's effectively as big as the universe.
Yeah.
It's colossally important because it's in the process of destroying us.
Yeah.
So yes, that is right. On the measuring in the lab thing, I sometimes say to people, "Well, is love real?"
Mm.
And most people will find it hard to deny that love is real. But can it be measured?
Mm.
Absolutely not. Can it be reproduced in the lab? Absolutely not. But they say, "Oh yes, it can. We can put you in a scanner and we can see things light up and we can measure oxytocin and so forth." But what they don't understand is the difference between a token that represents a possible part of something and the whole thing itself.
Mm.
And it's like mistaking the word love for love itself.
Mm.
And this is the world that we're in, and this is an important difference between the left and right hemisphere, is that the right hemisphere is in touch with the real presence of whatever it may be. And the left hemisphere categorizes it and represents it, which literally means makes it present again when it is no longer present.
Mm.
So it's a kind of fake. And I think what Wordsworth was pointing out when he talked about, how when he was a boy, that the mountains were speaking to him as, real living forces, and the waterfalls and the birds and the trees and all this stuff. But then as he gets older, the representations of them substitute. So, and we can all do this, we can go somewhere and we'll see a really stunning landscape and we immediately go, picturesque landscape, put it in that box,
Mm.
But actually, as soon as you've done that, you've removed the presence of the thing from you. And we now live in a very thin representation of the world, not in the full power of the presence of reality. And that is a distinctly right-left difference.
In a way, that's why children can always see the world more clearly than adults. I was really struck with my own children. We live on a piece of land in Ireland, and they grew up just homeschooled, running around in the woods, running around in the fields, and endlessly
Wonderful.
having conversations with trees and talking to fairies, and chatting with birds and all of this kind of stuff. And obviously now they're teenagers. That's not there anymore. The layer is still underneath, but there's in a way it's almost a process of maturing. The process of growing old forces you in some way to represent the world to yourself. But like you say, if you're not very careful and if you live in the wrong culture, then you end up confusing the map with the territory. And actually,
Yes.
this brings us to technology quite well, because my book Against the Machine is not about technology per se, but it seems to me that the technological infrastructure that exists at the moment is a manifestation of that way of seeing. So humans have always created tools, but the tools that they create will be a manifestation of their understanding of the world. And so a tool like the internet, which we're both talking to each other on at the moment, almost seems like a classic version of that left brain representation of reality, because there's a whole generation now which I think is growing up, which in some way is confusing that map with the territory. Because if you live online all the time and your phone is in your pocket all the time and you're on screens all the time, it's very easy to confuse that. It's easy for me to think that I'm actually sitting in a room talking to you, but I'm not. I've never actually met you in the flesh. And yet here we are doing something that's real and measurable, and yet at the same time, this entire infrastructure that's built up around us, and AI is accelerating this to the hundredfold, is creating a version of reality which in some ways is fundamentally not real at all.
Yes, and I don't want to decry the uses of technology. I benefit from aspects of technology, but there's always a price paid for it, even for electric light. I mean, of course, I don't want to go back to living by candles, although when there are power cuts here, I often think, well, this would be rather wonderful.
Quite enjoyable,
But
aren't they, actually, power cuts?
quite enjoyable. But to be serious, I mean, I don't for a minute doubt the value of various advances in technology, in medicine, in daily life, and the internet has its uses. For example, without having to make a very long journey, you and I can actually talk in this way, which is a wonderful thing. But so I'm not, you see, the trouble is, nowadays there's a very extremist way of thinking. So people think if you're not for something, you must be against it completely.
It seems
And
quite left hemisphere as well to me, actually.
it
There's
is
no, there's no
completely the left
nuance.
hemisphere. No. I mean these ambiguous figures like the duck rabbit that I talk about in the book. The right hemisphere is able to suspend judgment and say that it can be both. But the left hemisphere says, but it can't be both. It can only be one or the other. And this one or the other mentality leads to extreme positions. So I would say, generally speaking, technology has both good and bad outcomes, but taken too far in certain directions, the dangers suddenly ramp up so far that it's a place we shouldn't be going at all. The difficulty is, how do we stop ourselves? How do we not do it?
So
It
it's
reminds me of a
sorry,
story
go on.
that I remember a friend of mine saying that she had a children's party, and the children were playing, and one of them came to her and said, "We're being naughty and we don't know how to stop."
That's very honest.
It's very honest, but they could see that actually what they were doing was wrong and wasn't getting them anywhere, but they didn't know
Mm,
how to get out of the mess they were in.
mm.
I really think that's worth considering when we look at the current plight we're in and due to ever escalating advances in so-called AI.
That's a kind of good slogan for modern Western culture, I think, isn't it? We're being naughty and we don't know how to stop.
It is, it is.
That's brilliant. Well, earlier you made this point about you used China as an example of a society that develops science but doesn't develop scientific materialism. And it always
Well,
seems
it
to me,
has now, but
well, it has now, yes, under our influence for whatever reason. But one of
yeah,
the other writers I talk about in the book is Jeremy Nadler, whose book In the Shadow of the Machine is really almost a critique of this kind of
yes.
technology. But he produces various examples of societies like ancient Egypt, which did develop certain technologies but didn't use them. And it seems to me that a left hemisphere dominated society, as you're putting it, will develop certain types of technology that will take us in certain directions. So again, the question is not, is technology good? Because humans have always used it in different ways. But a different kind of culture will develop different technologies. So the kind of technologies that we're developing now are technologies that I suppose perhaps you could say don't have the oversight of the right hemisphere. They don't see the whole. Would that be right, do you think?
I think that's one aspect of them, yes.
Mm,
And I don't know what you would say about this, but I used to say, well, technology is neither good or bad. It depends on the person who's using it and to what end. But I now feel that that's not strong enough. I think
no.
that some kinds of technological advance are in themselves so dangerous and so damaging that they can be called, well, I think they can be called evil
Mm.
if they are trying to effectively change us into forms of machines. It is a way of destroying humanity, of course.
Yeah, I think the notion that technology is neutral is one of the great myths of the culture that we live in at the moment. Because, as you said,
Yes.
some technologies are clearly not neutral. An atomic bomb is not a neutral technology. You know,
No.
it can only do one thing. Remember Marshall McLuhan talking about the medium and the message back in the day in his book
Mm.
Understanding Media, and he said that people repeatedly confuse the medium and the message, but actually the message has about as much importance as the stenciling on the casing of an atomic bomb. You know, what actually
Yes.
matters is the thing that you've designed. So you could even talk about I don't know, you could use any example of a certain technology that is a manifestation of a certain mindset and say, well, it isn't a neutral thing because it will only take us in a certain direction. But anyway, we are where we are with that. Um,
Yes.
So I just stepping back a bit, what would you say the reception has been to your work? I mean, in the mainstream, I mean, it's made a big impact in many ways, but do you think that the mainstream consensus, the scientific consensus, whoever it is that you're trying to speak to, do you think it's shifting the dials, the work that you're doing?
I don't really know, is the answer. I think there were certain early adopters, like Ramachandran, who is a toweringly important figure in the history of neuroscience, and others, some of whom you'll find me quoting their words on covers or on my website or whatever. But so I think there are plenty of people who see what I'm on about, and there are people across continents in America, in Germany, in Italy, and so on, who are in the field and who write to me and say, you know, your work is of huge importance. I think the difficulty is that because what I'm saying is so tied up with a, a cosmology which is quite different from what one might, for shorthand, call the Dennett and Dawkins version, that it'll take time but it's gathering momentum.
Hmm.
And what's interesting is that people in all kinds of walks of life that I never anticipated asked me to go to their conferences and speak about it. So, economists and politicians, two areas I know very little about, particularly the economists. And I never anticipated that for them it would seem important, but it apparently does. Obviously, for philosophers and psychiatrists and neuroscientists, psychologists, but also lawyers. I mean, the number of lawyers that have invited me to. I was just a couple of weeks ago talking to a group of senior judges in London. The Chief Justice of Australia got me to go out there and talk to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to Australia in a very short while, about 10 days' time, to talk to a convocation of bishops. Every kind of constituency. I have writers who communicate with me in all kinds of walks of life, including one who's a long-distance lorry driver in Australia and another who's a cleaner. Rather unusual cleaner, because I think he has a doctorate from Oxford, but nonetheless.
Interesting combination.
I think what one can say is it's very diverse, the people that it hits and moves. And whether, you know, the strict question as to how much I will have moved the orthodoxy in science, I don't know. But, you know, I really do think Max Planck was right, that progress in science doesn't happen because you change the minds of people who are brought up thinking of certain things. It's a very remarkable person who's able to go, that's interesting, I'm going to change my mind. I mean, scientists just don't tend to do that. And there's a good reason, because on the whole, you want to stick with the paradigm and not give it up every time somebody comes up with something that doesn't fit. But there does come a point when you have to let go of the paradigm and make a shift. And that usually happens when a younger generation come along who see more in it. And I have a lot of young aspiring neuroscientists who write to me and say, can I supervise their work? Can I, et cetera, et cetera. And sadly, I can't, because I live remotely and I'm not in academia or in the hospitals anymore because I'm old. But I think, no, I think it's definitely having an impact.
It's interesting that you talk about that there are these paradigm shifts in science, and as you say, it's as if something builds up and builds up and builds up until it's impossible to resist anymore. I suppose you could look at something like the theory of relativity as an example of that. But I feel like in society as a whole, there's a build-up of that kind that's going on at the moment. You mentioned
Yes.
the Dennett and Dawkins thesis is pretty much roundly rejected, even by a lot of atheists these days. And there's something that is happening to, especially to younger people who have had to grow up with this damaged way of seeing. That I feel like a lot of people, and I get a lot of people writing to me about this. A lot of people are looking around for somebody to help them demonstrate that what they feel is true, which is, I think, what a lot of your work does. You know, they can all feel what's broken, but they don't know what it is. They don't know how to explain it. They don't know if they're just mad and whether they should even say what they feel. I get a lot of this kind of writing precisely because I do a fair bit of writing these days about my kind of religious journey, which was a surprise to me in a way, especially since I wrote The Cross and the Machine. I get a lot of young people writing to me who have been on a very, very similar journey, and they are returning to religion, often Christianity, but not always that, um, because they can see that that worldview, that left hemisphere dominated worldview, is just inadequate to explain what they can feel. And I find that really striking. Just in the last 5 to 10 years, I've seen that accelerating in a way that you could never have imagined even a decade ago. So it feels like there's some sort of breaking point approaching with this worldview that we've all been living under for a long time. I don't know if you feel the same thing.
I really do. And why do I think that? It's because of, as I say, the individual reactions of people to my work, but also the reports I hear that confirm it. One very interesting thing I heard quite recently, and I can't remember the exact age range of the group of young people, but it was probably something like 18 to 30, were asked about their hopes and fears, and something like very nearly 50% of them, 47% or 49% even, I can't remember, said that they wish they had been born in an era before the internet.
Yeah,
That's extraordinary that they're actually seeing the downside of it. Well, it's not really surprising, because if you put two and two together and you see your classmates, your co-evils are distraught, harming themselves, adopting damaging habits, and feel rootless and directionless and so on, then you would deduce that there's something wrong, and a lot of it is going to be to do with that thing in your hand. But the thing that really chilled me was reading this article that I was sent a couple of days ago, quoting somebody, I think in the WEF, the World Economic Forum, which I feel is a center for the dissemination of evil projects.
There's a lot of evil ideas and crazy ideas coming out of those guys for sure. Yes.
Yes, and one thing they were saying is by 2030, a mobile phone will be obsolete because we'll all have to have chips in us, and those chips will give us access to everything we need. So, I mean, you can refuse it, but how will you go shopping? How will you get on a train? How will you make an appointment with a doctor? Because everything will be funneled through this chip, which records everything about you and potentially has the capacity, believe it or not, to interfere with your mind, with your mentation, with even your emotions. Now, I don't know how right this is, or whether this is paranoia or what, but I think we're moving in that direction. And what we need is a group of people, a very, very large group of people, who will simply say, no, this is too far. And I'm worried that already, I don't know whether we want to go to politics, but one of the most appalling things going on is this passage of the banter bill. I don't know if you know about this, but they want to pass a bill which makes the owner of the premises on which a worker works responsible for any of the comments made on the premises by any other employee.
I haven't heard that one. Right. That doesn't sound very well.
So, I mean, a good example is if, I were to say something that didn't fit with the current narrative about sex differences or whatever, and somebody decided, and this is the real evil in it, the person decides whether it is offensive. If I say it's offensive, then it is offensive. And so anybody can... is worrying and concerning. And it is causing a lot of problems, and it will... Sorry, did I lose you there?
You cut out for a second there, but you're back.
Okay, that's good. But, I am very concerned about how that will just be another thing that makes it almost impossible for us to talk openly with one another, relax, have a pint, have a laugh. I mean, the things that actually make life really good.
Well, I think generally the desire by states to control speech, especially in Europe, is, to me, it's a manifestation of kind of establishment concern about how bothered people are about any number of trends, because they wouldn't need to keep doing this if it wasn't the case that people wanted to keep complaining. In terms of the
Yes,
technology, I mean,
exactly.
the way, I mean, again, there's a good deal of writing about this in Against the Machine, but the notion of the Internet of Bodies is not a conspiracy theory. That's exactly where things are supposed to go next. So the smartphone is precisely supposed to be a kind of stepping stone towards the chip in the body. The Internet of Things is where everything is connected to the web, whether it's your fridge or your car or whatever, and that's already manifesting. And the next stage is the Internet of Bodies. And the Internet of Bodies is where the rational thing to do is to have a chip in your hand, in your right hand, which is where the mark of the beast is said to be, by the way, in the book of Revelation. But no, I'm sure that's a pure coincidence. But you have that, and people have done this already, by the way. People in various parts of the world already chipped. I met a man once who had a chip in his arm who liked to call himself the world's first cyborg, and this was 10 or 15 years ago, and he was very pleased with it.
I think
Um,
you wrote about it, yes.
yeah, I think I did. And so this is very much the way that the future is supposed to be planned. And again, from the perspective of your thesis about left hemisphere dominance, it makes perfect rational sense,
Oh,
because everything is connected
absolutely.
to everything else. We can do everything just with the chip in our arms. We're connected. I mean, you can walk into a shop with this chip in your arm. There don't need to be any human beings in the shop to sell you things. You walk through the shop, the scanners will notice what you've picked up, and then you just walk out of the shop again. Very rational. At the same time, the money will be taken from your bank account. You don't have to get your credit card out. You don't have to speak to any human beings. The whole world becomes this frictionless technological thing, which a certain type of person, who is very left hemisphere dominated, presumably, thinks is wonderful. The same sort of people who think that terraforming Mars is wonderful and going to live in space and mining asteroids and uploading our minds into the cloud, because, again, based using your notion, this is it's a purely rational thing to do. It makes perfect sense. If you disregard what the right hemisphere can see, if you disregard the whole picture, I listen to that vision of the world and I have this sense of rising horror. But I've
Mm,
spoken to people who think it's absolutely fantastic, and there's such a gulf between those worldviews. It
mm,
seems very
mm,
difficult to. I mean, this is a question really we ought to get to: is how on earth can you actually bridge that gulf between these two
mm,
radically different ways of seeing? Because the people who
mm,
control the narrative and the people who create the technology are rushing us very, very fast into this robotic left hemisphere world, which takes us into, yeah, goodness knows what horror. But as I say, they don't see it as horror. They see it as utopia.
yes. Gosh, there's so much to say about all of that. Part of it is, I think, the complete loss of any understanding of what it means to be human, to be a human being. We no longer know who we are, what we're doing here, and everything that makes life more frictionless, even if we sacrifice our freedom, our dignity, and everything to just being this consuming entity that needs to be, serviced with food and whatnot, and preferably shouldn't travel and should and allow the state to read its mind so that it's not going to think any contrary thoughts. Can't people see that this drive towards conformity and mechanism I mean, if it were to succeed, would completely destroy our liberty, and our dignity, and a lot of the things that it would give to us are simply like sweeties, probably literally sweeties. But I'm thinking, when people talk about wanting to become a machine, of the very famous story of Pinocchio, which was of a mechanism that wanted to become a real person. I mean, Pinocchio wanted to be a real boy. And in the actually not at all bad Disney film of it, which I remember seeing in my childhood, he's taken by somebody almost like a sort of grooming person to a playland in which everything is shiny and colored and nobody needs to do any work. And for a minute, he's sort of seduced by this and has to learn the hard way that actually that is not going to be a route to anywhere that he wants to go, and it's not compatible with being alive. But I would get, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will go, "What is he talking about?" But I want to say, I think we completely mistake ourselves when we think that every kind of friction, every kind of opposition, every kind of restriction is something that should be done away with and is negative. Fulfillment is often something which doesn't come unless you've overcome some kind of obstacle in doing it. And in doing so, you increase the capacity of what a human being can do, and certainly what you can do. But somebody who has never done that and has never actually suffered or had their will thwarted will be turning into a monstrous person who will have no friends and is not a good person to know. Suffering is part of what makes us fulfilled. And I say that quoting Viktor Frankl, I mean, who after all saw his family destroyed in a concentration camp and only narrowly escaped with his life from one himself. But I mean, he, after all, was an authoritative figure, and he said the three things that make a human life fulfilled are that being together with other human beings, which I know there is a vast amount of evidence that this is important to human happiness and health. He didn't say together with nature, which I think is an important one, but he did say feeling that you have overcome some obstacle in order to achieve something important. And the third thing was to have suffered, and that in suffering we are humanized. And so obviously suffering is not something one should seek out, of course, and there is suffering that is so unconscionable and so appalling that it's hard to know what to say about it, and it's a famous problem for all of us to understand it. But nonetheless, resistance and what we call the negation of things is often the pathway to something greater. You know, Goethe has this line, in der Beschränkung zeigt sich erst der Meister. In limitation, it is that the master shows his mastery. And you know, it's famous that poets have often been forced into their best lines by the tyranny of a rhyme scheme and a meter.
Yeah.
And so, and after all, definition, which makes a thing what it is, the defining of it is the separation of it from something else, and that means it has some boundaries. That doesn't mean that it's atomistically divided forever from everything, but in order to be an identifiable entity, it has at least to be distinct, and part of that is the forming of boundaries. Sorry, I went off on a slight tangent there.
No, that's very interesting. Chesterton said to love anything is to love its boundaries, which came up as
It's very good.
Limits.
Sorry, just before we move on, Chesterton also said something that occurred to me earlier when you said, "But look, this is all rational." People say, yes, and I have dealt with a lot of highly rational people who are mad. Not just my verdict, but everyone's. So one of the things about schizophrenia is that we used to say that people lose their reason. And Chesterton said a madman is not someone who's lost his reason, but has lost everything but his reason. And that's manifest in schizophrenia. So they're not irrational. They have lost their reason in the sort of sense of being reasonable people, acquainted with experience. You know, so they hear a voice in the room, there's nobody there. They think, how can that have got into the room? It must be through that socket over there, and the neighbors have got into the wiring and are broadcasting messages through the socket. And it sort of makes a kind of scientific rationalist sense, but it makes no reasonable sense to anybody who knows anything about the world.
No, I was just thinking about limits there, and suffering, actually, because Every religion,
Yes.
every religion in the world teaches that suffering is the path to God, to enlightenment, to spiritual improvement. And again, you're not supposed to intentionally seek it out, but when it comes to you, it's given to you for a reason. And the society we live in now teaches that the greatest good is to abolish suffering. And it's not that that's, again, nuance. It's not that that's always a bad thing. Sometimes it's good to abolish suffering. It's good to have medical advances and various things that we value. But
Of
once you
course.
put this on a pedestal and you are prepared to sacrifice almost everything to a safety focused utopia, then what do you really get what Aldous Huxley wrote about in Brave New World, which is precisely where we are, it seems to me. You have a safety focused utopia in which people give up their freedom in exchange for pleasure. Um, the entirety of the Silicon Valley mindset, and I've done a fair bit of studying of this and spoken to some of the people involved in it, is precisely about removing suffering from all human life, which is seen as the greatest good. It's extremely utilitarian. If we can remove all suffering, then we have succeeded. And the ultimate way to remove all suffering is to abolish death, which is then to abolish it's just to abolish humanity. And the whole
Yes.
thing rubs up against limits. So every traditional society, every religious teaching says limits are important. You have to push up against them. Suffering matters. That's what changes you. That's what helps you to grow. This mindset says, no, we abolish those things. We don't need them. What you want is ease and a lack of suffering and the end of death. And it ends up being weirdly a precisely inverted version of, say, the Christian story, in which we have an ascent to heaven, but the heaven that we ascend to is the uploading of our minds into a silicon cloud or into an AI. It's a very weird sort of almost autistic utilitarian view of what a suffering free world will look like, and it ends up being something that looks to me like hell. Actually, ironically,
Mm.
it ends up looking like a place in which there is no freedom, there is no humanity, there is nothing that we would recognize as any of those things at all. So it's almost as if we get to see the consequences of our own fantasies almost playing out around us.
Yes, that's right. And we wouldn't be able to be creative because I believe that nothing is created without a degree of suffering. There, there has to be a push against something that causes something to come into being. Um, People may disagree about that, but in any case, I think, like you and like all the great religious traditions, that we grow and become more through suffering and through death. As Goethe said, death is nature's way of making more life. And that's an important insight in itself. But also from the individual point of view, and I don't believe that ultimately we are only an individual isolate. Even from an individual's point of view, there does come a point when death is a good thing, a welcome thing. I remember Mary Midgley, who I could count as a friend, and saying when she was in her mid-90s that she didn't want to live forever.
Yeah.
And once you realize how appalling it would be if you could actually never stop it, I mean, life would go on, whatever you did, it would just go on and on forever. And immediately you can see that it's only a question of, so when do you want it to stop?
Mm.
And nowadays we believe that all the portion sizes should be bigger. But I think there's a great deal of wisdom in, roughly speaking, 70 to 80 years.
Yeah, it's not a bad one. It's not a bad number, is it? So the matter with things, which is bigger than my attempt to read it and understand it all, but the matter with things seems to me to be about metaphysics. There's a metaphysical basis to it. There's a spiritual basis to it. There's something that sort of always lingers in the background of the book, which is that the nature of consciousness is more than we think it is, and that there is a spiritual basis to life. I don't know if you'd say that was accurate and what your view would be on this, because if we're going to move beyond this kind of broken way of seeing that we've been talking about for an hour, some sort of it's got to have some sort of spiritual basis to it, it seems to me. But that word obviously is both loaded and capacious and could mean lots of different things. I just wonder if you have a sense of where that leaves you, what you believe is the kind of if we were to talk now about what would be a better way of living than the one we're in at the moment and how to move towards it, what sort of spiritual basis do you think there should be for it? I know it's a huge question.
It is a huge question. There's a more manageable question which is implied there, which is how important would having a spiritual outlook be?
Mm.
And my answer to that is essential. And I think of what Solzhenitsyn said when he looked back on the horrors of the 20th century, which in large measure he had experienced. And he said, when I asked myself how this could have happened, the only answer I can give is because men have forgotten God.
Yeah.
And it's a phrase that I come back to and come back to. And when people ask about, well, what can we do in this current mess that we're in? I think, well, one of the important things is that we must rediscover the sanctity, the sacredness of existence, of the cosmos in general. The word means the beautiful, and it's coined by Pythagoras. And his vision of the cosmos was that it had intrinsic creative power and beauty, and I believe that is the case. I don't think it's directionless at all. And although physicists have known this for at least 100 years, finally, biologists are catching up and saying, no, it was ridiculous denying that things have any kind of direction or purpose. Life seems to be the obvious one that clearly does, and we could talk about that if you want. But anyway, I think rediscovering that is essential. And of course, there are practical steps to do with politics, and there are increasingly more spiritual answers. I mean, when people ask me what should we do, I say, well, there are probably 3 levels on which we can think of this, and the one that you will possibly have been indoctrinated into thinking is the most important is frankly the least important, and the one that is the least important apparently is the most important. And what I'm referring to there is, yes, belonging to a pressure group that will help to change policy. That is obviously an important step forward. Historically, so far, it's been remarkably poor in achieving an outcome. The second level is that of I'm trying to think of his name, Dougal Hine, at work in the ruins. And I don't know if you know that, but it's
Yes, I do indeed, yeah.
yeah. So his vision, as you know, then is that we may not be able to avoid the coming of the ruins, but we need to be at work already, finding ways of living that are sustainable and able to be, as it were, disseminated on a larger scale once people are able to see that this is a way forward. And that way forward would be a more humble way of looking at life with fewer demands and with greater fellowship and communion with the earth and other spiritual things. But the third element in the picture is that of changing your own heart and mind, that in fact there is nothing more important than the disposition of your soul towards the world. And it's the only thing that you actually have control over. These other things you can only minimally influence. But the one thing you can really definitely deal with is the thing that is under your control, which is your own way of thinking, feeling, and being. And you can start that tomorrow. And and then they say, oh, well, that's so small, but what does it matter what I do? But actually, nothing would ever change in the world if everybody thought that way. It only changes because often quite small groups of people start to think quite differently about what life should be like.
Yeah.
And Christ himself was and his small group of disciples were a bit like that. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's always struck me that one of the reasons that political revolutions inevitably fail is that the people who carry them out precisely haven't done that. They've just gone out there with their grand vision of how the world should work, but they haven't made themselves work properly, and so they reproduce the tyranny that they're trying to replace in the first place. Yeah, well, speaking of Christ, it's very interesting to me that he didn't write anything down, didn't give us a book, just gave us a church, just gave us a community actually, and said, okay, go and live like this. And the early Christians used to call the teaching of Christ the way, which is rather lovely because it also echoes the kind of Taoist understanding of the world. Go and live like,
Yes.
go and do this, and go and treat other people like this. This is the way to do it. And it's interesting you mentioned Dougal because Dougal and I started the Dark Mountain Project about 15 years ago,
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course you
But
know one another.
yeah, well, we worked together for a while. I haven't seen him for quite a while, but his book is yeah, his book is very good, and it echoes something that came out of that project right from the beginning, which is precisely that notion that things are probably coming down, but when they come down, there's an opportunity to start doing things differently again. And I feel like that's exactly what's going on. Um,
Mm.
and I suppose you must get this question all the time when you're speaking to lawyers and you're speaking to bishops and you're speaking to all of these different people, and they're presumably asking you, so what are we going to do about this? Because you've
Mm.
laid out this enormous roadmap, this mental
Mm.
map of the world. It seems
Mm.
sometimes like it's very different to get where we want to be from where we are, if not impossible.
Yes. Well, yes, and I think what they're looking for usually is what the left hemisphere would like, which is I'm going into
5 point
supercharged,
plan.
yeah, I need a 5 point plan,
Hmm.
and I need bullet points. These are the things to do, and then I'll go away and do them. But Christ didn't say that. Christ said, you have been taught that there are the Ten Commandments and so on. But I say to you, there are only two commandments: love God and love your neighbor.
Hmm.
I may be misquoting, but roughly speaking,
Hmm.
that was
No,
the
that's it.
drift.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, in other words, it was not a number of things to do, but it was of being, not a code.
It's a
And
way of
when I
relation.
think about a way of relating, and everything is relational, I argue not just human things, but actually the whole business of anything that exists comes out of a relational process, a resonant relationship between different aspects of consciousness, which doesn't mean that we make it all up, but we haven't got time to go there. Yeah, no, so if you like, Christ didn't say, these are the bullet points, this is my 5 year plan, go away and do it. When I think about what has really changed my life, it has been knowing people, particularly probably during my adolescence. There were a couple of people, but more than that really, but who influenced me. And people said, well, what did they tell you? And it's not so much what they told me, is that they modeled for me a way of being that I wanted to be like. I wanted to be like them and to have that way of being and approaching the world. And that is the greatest gift, is to be not told how to do something in the abstract with a number of rules. That's just the left hemisphere, and that's the way AI would deal with it.
Mhm.
But is inhabiting the being of another person to the extent that you can, so that you become more like them.
Yeah. How to be, how to have a relationship. It's really the entire story you're telling is a story about a broken relationship, it seems to me, with much of the rest
Yes,
of the world. Broken relationship with nature, with culture, with individual people, with our own
yes,
minds, with our own way of comprehending. Um, it's and that's fundamentally the so-called solution to the problem. Is precisely a solution about a relationship. Interestingly, when Christ appears first in the Bible, the first thing he says is, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And the translation from the Greek, and I don't know because I don't speak Greek, but repent means turn around. It means change yourself. It means transform yourself. It doesn't mean, as I used to believe, say sorry immediately or God will punish you. It means, you need
yes,
to transform your heart because the
yes.
kingdom of heaven is at hand. And unless you transform yourself, nothing
Mm.
changes. So, as you say, the work that seems to the kind of to the left hemisphere to be a ridiculous waste of time, which is self-transformation, trying to relate differently
Mm.
to things, and not just to other people, but to the natural world as well. Our relationship with nature is so broken. The way that we speak of resources, the way that we speak of harvesting, and the rest of it, and even
Yes,
even even terms like biodiversity, which treat the natural world as a kind of horrible
absolutely.
mathematical puzzle to be solved. It's and the thing about this as well that's significant, something else we discovered when we were at Dark Mountain, people need communities to do this in. This is the thing.
Yes,
It's
they
very
do.
hard to do on your own. If you feel like you're isolated from the world and you're living in this left hemisphere world and you can see things differently, but you don't know what to do, it's very hard to do it on your own, which is one value of the internet because people can connect with people who are seeing the same thing. But it seems to me that
Yes.
that the kind of work we're talking about requires people to get together and kind of make those changes happen at some community level.
I agree with you, but also I think that puts it too much on its own in the left hemisphere territory, that it's having a plan and talking about it, and of course all that is important. But the thing that a religion offers is a kind of embodied wisdom, which is in acts which are carried out together that have deep meaning and help to change your, you turn round, as you say, convertere in Latin also, ad dominum Deum tuum, you turn round to your God. So conversion is a kind of turning of the mind or the heart, and it will enable you to do that. So I think that, you know, true rituals are phenomenally powerful, and I've experienced that in my life in a
Absolutely, me too.
shatteringly powerful way, that leaves one sort of more or less speechless and so moved, and it's and to the left hemisphere ritual is just a repetition of something that doesn't have a meaning. But this is why I worry enormously about the left hemisphere's attempt to create something that is a simulacrum of thinking in a material object that cannot think, because it also has no body. It cannot understand emotion, except it can read that when humans do this, it causes them to feel something they don't like. And what, but that's not the same as having feeling, and it's not the same as being embodied. They can't be embodied in the way that we are. They're not organic beings, and they are incapable of knowing what it means to suffer and the prospect of death, which, as Dr. Johnson says, sharpens a man's mind. But the fact that we live in this strange way in which we deny death and we deny suffering, and I mean, in the past, I would have had, from age, in my teens, I would have a skull on my desk to remind me that this is where it all ends, and this knowledge of that curiously doesn't undermine the value of what one's doing, but actually gives it meaning. In a world where none of this was true, there wouldn't be any meaning anyway.
No, it does do that. I feel like one of the things I suggested in the book at the end of the chapter in which you feature, which is challengingly called "The West Must Die," by which I mean the modern notion of the Western mind. I had this sense that we broke the world, and so we have a duty to fix it. It feels like that to me, we Western people. That I'm just thinking about what you say there about AI as well. We think we're fixing it that way, but we can't create an intelligence. The thing we're creating is profoundly unintelligent. It's just it's a machine that reproduces rather than generates. Even though we call it generative AI, it's not generative at all. No. And so it's what we're doing at the moment is in one sense terrifying, and in another sense clearly a dead end. So that way of turning around, and you mentioned religion. Of course, religion gives you the community within which you can turn around, within which you can repent and change. So much of what you're talking about here really ends up inevitably in a spiritual place. This is kind of the however hard we try to go somewhere else, this is where we end up, which is kind of the story of my life as well, curiously.
Interesting. Yes. I was thinking that because that's what's so wonderful about the cross and the machine, is that, you know, you did everything you could to keep away from
avoid it desperately. But I do think now that, you know, after so many years of writing and attempting to think, and I just think humans are profoundly religious animals, and everything you say about ritual is precisely the case. There is, as I say, there is no human culture that I've ever come across, with the exception of this one, that does not have ritual and religion and a reaching towards the eternal at the very heart of the culture. That's what a culture is, and we're seeing the consequences of kind of tearing that heart out.
Well, that's right, and I think that only a crass philosophy such as scientific materialism, if it's forced down our throats for long enough, can prevent us from feeling and seeing what it is that is calling to us.
But it doesn't work, does it? Because we can still feel it.
We can still feel it, and I believe that Dawkins still feels it actually. But
I think he's coming close to a deathbed conversion.
yeah,
He's on the
there
way.
we go. There we go. Well, that's not a bad thing. If it,
Exactly. Yeah, that's it.
but no, I think that's right. I mean, it's if we're not trained not to think about these ideas that we call religious, then they would be natural to us. And one of the most pernicious idea is another idea of Dawkins is that children would never think like this if they hadn't been indoctrinated into it at school. And he sent, a sort of loud email, which I slightly parodied him for. So he said, "How dare you," in capital letters,
Yes, yeah.
do this? And then I quote the evidence from research on this, the psychosocial research, which shows that children naturally do think like this and experience things that they then get told, no, don't, that's telling lies and none of that can be true and forget it, and no, you must think like this. And so the exact opposite of what Dawkins claims, that they're indoctrinated into it, they're indoctrinated out of it
Yeah, yeah, precisely. By the entire culture.
by the entire culture.
But as we've discussed, it doesn't feel like it's working anymore. So if I had one final question for you, it would simply be to those people who are watching this, who are nodding along and feeling as I have felt, kind of uplifted by your work and have felt that so much is being explained to them here. What's the thing to take away that they can take away into their lives, that they could do, that they could perform, that they could live, that they could think about, that would what would you like
Well,
people what would you like people to most take away from your work, I suppose, would be the question. I know it's a big one.
it is. And that can be approached at all kinds of levels. And if you want the science and the philosophy, that's all fine, it's there. But I think the important thing is not to be bamboozled into the idea that it comes from the mass society we're in, that really only the people who control at the center can do anything. No, you are important, whoever you are. And as long as you maintain your freedom and practice freedom of thinking and freedom of imagining, that is enough. And it is the change in here that is the only important thing in the end. Only you can do it. Also, it is the only thing that is asked of you to do, to turn your mind, your heart, your spirit, I would say your soul, towards the richly beautiful, creative, I think sacred cosmos, and not worry about the things to do, because they will follow. If you really internalize that, you'll see what it is you need to do. I really very strongly believe that. And I also believe it on the evidence of, really countless people who, bless them, and I hope they will carry on doing this, write to me and say, your book has changed my life. And it wasn't because they learned a couple of rules and things to do, like meditate for 20 minutes every morning, although I'm not against doing that. I think it's fine and rather a good idea. But it's not at that level that things need to change. It's seeing something differently. And I suppose what I've aimed to do in my work is to go, you think the world looks like this, but hello, look at this. And of course, I don't immediately produce that vision, but by gentle steps that are logical and therefore acceptable, I take people, I hope, to a place where they can stop feeling they have to deny certain really elementary but extraordinarily important aspects of what it means to be a living human being.
That's wonderful. Seeing differently is the work. That makes profound sense to me. I think that's a wonderful place to stop, even though we could easily talk for another 5 hours, maybe next time.
Oh, of course we could. Of course we could. But no, it's
Sorry,
been a great pleasure talking to you, and I hope we will talk again. And I want to, hear more. I mean, I'm privileged to have read your new book, Against the Machine, and I think it's exceptional and riveting and so beautifully readable and really, really important. I mean, I can't say more than that. So anyone who's listening to this, go out there when it comes. When is it? October it's coming
It's
out?
coming out on 23rd of September, so not too long.
23rd of September. 23rd of September. Very good. There you go.
I
All right.
appreciate that, Ian. That means a lot coming from you. Thank you. I really enjoyed talking
No,
to
no.
you.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
Okay, you
Bye
too.
bye.